October 12, 1985, Riverside, Oregon. A small town nestled in the Willamette Valley where everyone knew their neighbors and strangers were noticed immediately. The annual Harvest Fair had drawn crowds throughout the weekend, filling Main Street with the scent of caramel apples and the sounds of carnival games. Among the vendors sat Rebecca, a 42-year-old fortune teller whose modest booth had become a fixture at local events for nearly a decade. Rebecca had arrived Friday morning to set up her tent, decorated with deep purple fabric and strings of ambient lights. Her reputation in the community was solid. She read tarot cards and palms, offering guidance that many claimed had proven remarkably accurate over the years. She lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, her daughter Jennifer having moved to Portland for college 2 years prior. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." Sunday evening marked the fair's final hours. Vendors began packing their goods as families made their last rounds through the attractions. Several witnesses later reported seeing Rebecca at her booth around 7 in the evening, conducting what appeared to be her final reading of the night. A middle-aged man sat across from her, his features obscured by the dim lighting and the angle of observation. By 9 o'clock, when fair organizers made their final sweep of the grounds, Rebecca's booth stood empty. Her tarot cards remained spread on the velvet-covered table. Her purse sat tucked beneath the chair where she always kept it. The cash box, containing the weekend's modest earnings, remained untouched. Her car, a blue sedan, was still parked in the vendor lot where she had left it Friday morning. The fair coordinator, assuming Rebecca had perhaps walked home despite living 3 miles away, locked the cash box in the fair office for safekeeping. It wasn't until Monday afternoon when Rebecca failed to collect her belongings and her daughter Jennifer called the police after being unable to reach her mother for 2 days that concern transformed into alarm. Local authorities treated the initial report routinely. Detective Christopher led the investigation, a veteran officer who had worked missing persons cases throughout his 20-year career. He noted the organized state of Rebecca's booth, the presence of her personal items, and the untouched money. These details contradicted the theory of voluntary disappearance, yet no signs of struggle existed. Interviews with fellow vendors produced limited information. Most had been preoccupied with their own booths during the busy weekend. However, 3 separate witnesses mentioned seeing Rebecca speaking with an unfamiliar man during the fair's final hours. Descriptions varied slightly, but converged on certain details. Caucasian, approximately 40 years old, average height, wearing dark clothing. He had visited her booth multiple times throughout the weekend, though whether for readings or conversation remained unclear. The investigation expanded to include searches of the fairgrounds and surrounding areas. Volunteers combed through nearby woods and fields. Rebecca's cottage was examined thoroughly. Everything appeared normal, as if she had left Friday morning expecting to return Sunday night. Her calendar showed no unusual appointments. Her phone records revealed only routine calls to her daughter and a few local acquaintances. As days became weeks, the case began to cool. Detective Christopher pursued every lead, but without physical evidence or concrete witness testimony, the investigation stalled. Jennifer insisted her mother would never abandon her life voluntarily. They spoke every Sunday evening by phone, a ritual Rebecca cherished. She had been excited about Jennifer's upcoming visit for Thanksgiving. Plans had been made, a future anticipated. The local newspaper ran several stories about the disappearance, each generating tips that ultimately led nowhere. Theories circulated through the small community. Some suggested Rebecca had possessed knowledge of something dangerous and had been silenced. Others whispered about secret relationships or hidden debts. The rational explanation that she had simply chosen to vanish seemed implausible to those who knew her well, yet became the unofficial conclusion as months passed without answers. By the end of 1985, Rebecca's case joined the growing files of unsolved disappearances. Her booth materials were returned to Jennifer, who stored them in her mother's cottage, unable to sell the property or fully accept the loss. Detective Christopher continued checking for updates periodically, but with no new evidence emerging, the case gradually faded from active investigation. The Harvest Fair continued annually, though vendors who had known Rebecca felt an unspoken discomfort setting up their booths where hers once stood. The question of what happened that October evening lingered in Riverside like an unanswered prayer. Rebecca's daughter maintained hope for years, calling the police department quarterly to ask if any developments had occurred. The answer remained consistently disappointing. 38 years would pass before a forgotten recording would reveal that someone had known exactly what happened to Rebecca, someone who had documented their obsession with disturbing clarity, someone who had walked among the crowd that weekend, watching and waiting. The truth had been preserved on magnetic tape all along, waiting in darkness for the moment it would finally emerge into light. March 2023, Portland, Oregon. Dr. Richard, a 74-year-old retired clinical psychologist, stood in the basement of his suburban home surrounded by decades of accumulated belongings. After 42 years of practicing therapy, he had finally sold his private office downtown and brought the remaining files and equipment to sort through during retirement. His wife had been urging him to clear the space for months, and a scheduled move to a smaller residence made the task unavoidable. Among the boxes of outdated textbooks and framed certificates, Dr. Richard discovered a dusty container filled with cassette tapes. During the 1980s, he had recorded certain therapy sessions with patient consent, a common practice for review and professional development. The transition to digital systems in the late 90s had rendered these physical tapes obsolete, and they had been stored and forgotten for over 2 decades. Dr. Richard carried the box upstairs and spent an afternoon cataloging the tapes. Most were labeled with client initials and dates, following the confidentiality protocols of the era. As he sorted through them, one tape caught his attention. The label read September 1985, with only the initial T and no other identifying information. The handwriting was his own, though he had no immediate recollection of this particular client or session. Curious about the incomplete labeling, Dr. Richard located an old cassette player from another storage box. The device still functioned, despite its age. He inserted the tape and pressed play, uncertain what he would hear after nearly 4 decades. The audio quality was poor, marked by the hiss and warble characteristic of aging magnetic tape. But the voices were distinguishable. His own voice came through first, younger but recognizable, conducting the standard opening of a therapy session. Then came the client's voice, male, measured and calm, in a way that immediately struck Dr. Richard as controlled rather than relaxed. The session proceeded with discussion of workplace stress and social difficulties, topics that seemed routine on the surface. Approximately 20 minutes into the recording, the conversation shifted. The client began describing an intense fascination with a woman he had encountered at local events. He never used her name, referring to her only as someone who claimed to see the future, someone who understood things others could not. The language became increasingly obsessive as the session continued. Dr. Richard leaned closer to the speaker as the client described attending fairs and festivals specifically to visit this woman's booth. He detailed the conversations they had shared, interpreting ordinary professional interactions as deeply meaningful personal connections. The client expressed frustration that she failed to recognize their special bond, that she treated him like any other customer despite what he believed was an obvious spiritual connection between them. The psychologist listened with growing unease as his past self gently challenged these interpretations, attempting to redirect the client toward more realistic perspectives. The client resisted, becoming agitated when Dr. Richard suggested the woman was simply performing her professional role. The session notes on the tape indicated this was their 4th meeting, with previous sessions following a similar pattern of fixation. Near the end of the recording, the client made a statement that caused Dr. Richard to pause the playback. The man mentioned the upcoming harvest fair in Riverside, a town 40 miles from Portland. He spoke about planning to attend, about having one final opportunity to make the woman understand their connection. The way he phrased it carried an implication that made the retired psychologist's pulse quicken. Dr. Richard rewound and listened again, this time taking notes. The client's tone when discussing the fair suggested finality, a sense of approaching culmination. He spoke of not being able to wait any longer, of needing resolution one way or another. The session ended with Dr. Richard scheduling a follow-up appointment for the following week, but based on the absence of additional tapes, that appointment had apparently never occurred. The retired psychologist sat in silence after the recording ended, his mind working through the implications. September 1985. Riverside. A woman who told fortunes at fairs. An obsessed client speaking of final opportunities. He walked to his home office and opened his laptop, searching for information about Riverside and any incidents from that time period. The search results appeared within seconds. Multiple articles about an unsolved disappearance. A fortune teller named Rebecca, who had vanished from the Harvest Fair in October 1985. The timing aligned perfectly with the recording he had just heard. The description matched the woman his client had been obsessing over during their sessions. Dr. Richard felt a cold weight settle in his chest. For 38 years, this tape had sat in storage while a family searched for answers, while a case remained unsolved, while a daughter wondered what had happened to her mother. He had possessed potential evidence all along, unknowingly archived with dozens of other forgotten sessions. The ethical obligations were immediately clear. Despite the decades that had passed, despite confidentiality considerations that might have applied under different circumstances, this information needed to reach the appropriate authorities. Dr. Richard searched for contact information for the Riverside Police Department, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. As he dialed, another thought occurred to him. If this client had acted on his obsession in 1985, if he had been responsible for Rebecca's disappearance, what had his life looked like in the years since? Had there been other victims? Other women who had attracted his dangerous fixation? The tape represented not just evidence of one crime, but potentially a window into a pattern that had remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Dr. Richard took a deep breath, preparing to explain what he had discovered. The investigation that had gone cold in 1985 was about to be reopened, and the voice on that aging cassette tape would finally be heard by those who needed to understand its implications. Somewhere, a man who had thought his secrets safely buried in the past was about to learn that magnetic tape has a long memory. March 2023. Riverside Police Department. Detective Stephen had worked cold cases for the past 6 years, inheriting files that previous investigators had been unable to solve. The Rebecca disappearance from 1985 sat among dozens of others in the archive room, periodically reviewed but never advancing beyond the dead ends documented decades earlier. When Dr. Richard's call came through, Stephen initially approached it with cautious skepticism. Too often, supposed breakthroughs in old cases led nowhere. The detective drove to Portland that same afternoon to retrieve the cassette tape. Dr. Richard had preserved it carefully, understanding its potential significance. As Stephen listened to the recording in his vehicle before departing, the clinical detachment required for his work became difficult to maintain. The voice on the tape spoke with chilling certainty about making someone understand, about final opportunities, about the Riverside Fair scheduled for the following month after the recording date. Back at the department, Stephen assembled a small team to review the original case file alongside this new evidence. The 1985 investigation had included interviews with fairgoers and vendors, but the witness descriptions of the unknown man who had visited Rebecca's booth multiple times remained frustratingly vague. Now they had a voice, a psychological profile emerging from the therapy sessions, and most importantly, a starting point for identification. Dr. Richard had provided what records remained from that period. His client intake forms from 1985 listed a Thomas Miller, age 37 at the time, residing in Portland. The initial contact had come through a referral from a community health center. Thomas had attended 4 documented sessions in August and September before disappearing from treatment. No phone number remained in service. The address led to an apartment building that had been demolished in the 1990s. Detective Stephen ran the name through every available database. The search produced troubling results. Thomas Miller appeared in records until 1987, then vanished completely from documented existence. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no financial activity. The name simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. This pattern typically indicated either death or identity change, and given the circumstances, the latter seemed more probable. Further investigation revealed that in 1987, a man named Brian Patterson had legally changed his name through the Oregon court system. The petition had been filed from Portland. The birth date matched the Thomas Miller from Dr. Richard's records. Brian Patterson became the new focus of the investigation. Tracing Brian Patterson proved more successful initially. He had worked various jobs throughout the late 80s and 90s, moving between cities in Oregon and Washington. His employment history showed a pattern of short-term positions, frequent relocations, and gaps in documented work. Nothing in his background would have raised immediate flags to a casual observer. But when viewed through the lens of the therapy recording, the pattern suggested someone avoiding stability and scrutiny. Stephen expanded the search to include missing persons cases in cities where Brian had lived during those years. The results sent a chill through the investigation team. In 1988, a woman who worked at a county fair in Salem, Oregon, had disappeared. In 1991, another woman connected to a traveling craft show in Tacoma, Washington, had vanished. In 1994, a vendor at a farmer's market in Eugene, Oregon, had failed to return home after an event. All 3 cases remained unsolved. All 3 victims were women who worked at public events, interacting with crowds, visible and accessible. The team began detailed comparisons between these cases. While the circumstances varied, certain elements aligned disturbingly well. Each disappearance occurred at the conclusion of a multi-day event. Each victim was last seen during the final hours of operation. Each had spoken with an unidentified man in the days or hours before vanishing. Contemporary witness descriptions from these separate investigations, when compiled, created a composite that could plausibly represent the same individual aging across the years. Detective Stephen contacted the jurisdictions handling these cold cases, sharing information about Brian Patterson and the potential connection. Investigators in 3 cities began coordinating efforts, comparing notes that had never been cross-referenced before. The therapy recording provided psychological insight that recontextualized witness statements from all 4 cases. The obsessive fixation, the belief in special connections, the language about final opportunities, these elements now served as a framework for understanding a possible pattern of predatory behavior. Property records from the 1980s revealed that Thomas Miller, before becoming Brian Patterson, had owned a small parcel of rural land 40 miles from Riverside. The property, acquired in 1984, had been sold in 1996 to a development company that had never built on the site. It remained largely undeveloped, overgrown with vegetation, and accessible only by an unmaintained dirt road. Stephen obtained a warrant to search the property. The legal justification combined the therapy recording, the pattern of disappearances, and Brian's ownership of isolated land during the relevant time period. A forensic team was assembled, including specialists in ground-penetrating radar and outdoor evidence recovery. The search was scheduled for early April, giving the team time to prepare for what they might discover. As preparations continued, Stephen located more recent information about Brian Patterson. His trail had gone cold around 2002, with another apparent identity change. Tax records and employment history simply stopped. Either Brian had died, moved internationally, or assumed yet another identity. The investigation now faced a dual challenge: discovering what lay buried on that rural property and finding a man who had spent decades learning how to disappear. Dr. Richard's ancient cassette tape had opened a door that revealed far more than one unsolved case. The voice preserved on aging magnetic tape belonged to someone whose obsessions had potentially destroyed multiple lives across years and cities. The careful documentation of those therapy sessions, originally intended for clinical review, now served as evidence of premeditation and pattern. Someone who had seemed to vanish into comfortable obscurity was about to discover that the past, however carefully buried, could still reach forward through time to demand accountability. The excavation of that rural property would begin in 2 weeks, and whatever lay beneath the soil was about to bring decades of hidden darkness into the light. April 2023, 40 miles outside Riverside. The rural property once owned by Thomas Miller stretched across 5 acres of dense Oregon forest, untouched by development and slowly reclaimed by nature over nearly 3 decades. Detective Stephen stood at the property entrance as the forensic team began their systematic survey of the land. Ground-penetrating radar equipment would scan the soil for anomalies, disturbances that might indicate areas of interest for excavation. The technology had advanced considerably since 1985. What would have been impossible to detect decades ago now appeared on monitors as the team moved methodically across the property. Within the first 3 hours, multiple areas registered readings consistent with disturbed earth and buried materials. The team marked each location with flags, creating a grim map of potential grave sites. Excavation began at the location with the strongest readings, an area approximately 50 yards from what remained of an old access road. The team worked carefully, documenting every layer of soil removed. 18 inches below the surface, they encountered the first evidence: fragments of fabric, deteriorated but recognizable as synthetic material from clothing. 6 inches deeper, they found human remains. The forensic anthropologist on site conducted a preliminary examination. The remains were consistent with an adult female, buried for an extended period based on the degree of decomposition and soil integration. Personal items recovered near the remains included jewelry and a small metal compact mirror. These items would later be compared against missing persons reports and family descriptions. As work continued at the first site, additional teams began excavating the other marked locations. By the end of the first day, remains had been discovered at 3 separate sites on the property. Each excavation revealed similar patterns: shallow graves, personal effects buried alongside the victims, evidence of concealment, but not the sophisticated methods that might have prevented eventual discovery if anyone had thought to look. The investigation expanded dramatically. Forensic specialists worked to extract DNA from the remains for identification purposes. Meanwhile, Detective Stephen coordinated with the multiple jurisdictions whose missing persons cases potentially connected to this property. The media had learned about the excavation, and news crews gathered at the property perimeter, broadcasting images of the investigation that would reach audiences across the region. Identification of the first set of remains came through dental records. Rebecca, the fortune teller who had disappeared from the Riverside Fair in 1985, had been found. Her daughter Jennifer, now 51 years old, received notification 38 years after her mother had failed to return home. The confirmation brought both closure and renewed grief, answering the question of what happened while raising new questions about why and how. The second set of remains matched the missing woman from Salem, the third matched the victim from Tacoma, and the fourth matched the Eugene case. 4 women, 4 unsolved disappearances spanning from 1985 to 1994, all connected to public events, all found on property once owned by the same man. The pattern that investigators had theorized based on records and timelines now had physical confirmation in the most definitive way possible. Analysis of the burial sites provided additional information. The graves appeared to have been created at different times, consistent with the years when each woman had disappeared. The methods were similar, but showed slight variations, suggesting someone learning and adapting their approach over time. Forensic experts noted that the depth and concealment techniques improved with each subsequent burial, indicating a perpetrator who refined his methods based on experience. Evidence recovered from the sites included personal items that families would later identify: a distinctive ring, a watch, a necklace, objects that had been important enough for the victims to wear or carry but had ended up buried with them. These items would become crucial for formal identification and would eventually be returned to families who had waited decades for any trace of their missing loved ones. Detective Stephen reviewed the therapy recording again with this new context. Dr. Richard's patient had spoken about not being able to wait any longer, about needing resolution. The language took on darker meaning now. What had seemed like the rambling of someone with obsessive thoughts revealed itself as the planning of someone preparing to act. The recording captured a moment between fantasy and implementation, preserved accidentally for posterity. The search for Brian Patterson intensified. With physical evidence confirming multiple homicides and a clear pattern of predatory behavior, the investigation became a priority for law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Financial records from the 90s and early 2000s were subpoenaed. Associates from his various employments were interviewed. A psychological profile was developed based on the therapy sessions and the crime scene evidence. Investigators discovered that Brian had indeed changed his identity again in 2002, this time to Michael Ross. Under this name, he had moved to a suburb outside Seattle, Washington. He had lived there for over 20 years, maintaining a low profile, working in warehouse management, existing as an unremarkable middle-aged man in a quiet neighborhood. His neighbors would later express shock, describing him as quiet but polite, someone who kept to himself but caused no concern. The forensic team completed their work on the property after 2 weeks of intensive excavation. The final count stood at 4 confirmed victims, all matching the missing women from the cases spanning 1985 to 1994. No additional remains were discovered, though investigators could not rule out the possibility of other victims whose disappearances had never been reported or investigated. DNA evidence from the remains was preserved and entered into national databases. Comparison against family members provided definitive identifications. Each confirmation meant another family receiving the news they had both hoped for and dreaded. Their missing loved one had been found, but would not be coming home alive. The case that had begun with an elderly psychologist discovering a forgotten tape in his basement had evolved into one of the largest serial homicide investigations in Oregon history. 4 decades of secrets had been unearthed from the soil of that rural property. The voice on the cassette tape had been matched to a man with multiple identities, a man who had believed himself safely hidden behind name changes and time. That man was about to discover that modern forensic science and determined investigation could reach back through decades to pull buried truth into the light of justice. The quiet suburban life Michael Ross had built was about to end, and the reckoning he had avoided for so long was finally approaching. April 28, 2023, suburban Seattle, Washington. The quiet residential street where Michael Ross had lived for 21 years appeared like countless other middle-class neighborhoods across America. Modest homes with well-maintained lawns, families departing for work and school, the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Nothing about the location suggested it harbored someone connected to multiple disappearances spanning decades. Detective Stephen coordinated with Seattle law enforcement to execute the arrest warrant. The operation required careful planning. Though Brian, now living as Michael Ross, had no recent criminal record and no indication of violent behavior in his current life, his history suggested caution. A team of 12 officers assembled before dawn, positioning themselves around the target residence. At 6 a.m, officers approached the front door. Michael Ross answered within moments, appearing confused but compliant. He was 65 years old now, his appearance matching the progression one would expect from the man in 38-year-old identification photos. The arrest proceeded without incident. Michael was taken into custody, his home secured for search warrant execution. The search of Michael's residence revealed a life of deliberate ordinariness. The home contained typical furnishings, basic electronics, and few personal effects. What investigators did not find proved as significant as what they discovered. No photographs displayed on walls or shelves, no memorabilia from past decades, no connection to previous identities or locations. The house resembled a carefully maintained facade, a life constructed to avoid attention or scrutiny. However, in a locked storage unit rented under Michael's current identity, investigators made disturbing discoveries. Boxes contained newspaper clippings about all 4 disappearances, carefully preserved and organized chronologically. Photographs of women at various public events, taken from a distance, filled several albums. None of the subjects appeared aware they were being photographed. The collection spanned years, suggesting Michael had continued his pattern of observation and fixation even after the known victims. Among the stored items, investigators found journals documenting Michael's thoughts and activities from the 1980s through the early 2000s. The entries provided insight into his mindset during the period when the crimes occurred. He wrote about the women he observed, interpreting ordinary interactions as meaningful connections. The journals revealed a person who believed himself to be forming relationships that existed only in his imagination, becoming increasingly frustrated when reality failed to match his delusions. The entries stopped in 2002, the year Michael Ross had emerged as a new identity. Whether he had ceased his obsessive documentation or simply hidden those materials elsewhere remained unclear. The journals that did exist would become crucial evidence, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that aligned perfectly with the therapy recordings from 1985. Michael was transported to Oregon to face charges related to the discoveries on the rural property. During the journey, he remained silent, requesting legal representation and refusing to answer questions. His demeanor appeared calm, almost resigned, as if he had always known this moment would eventually arrive, despite decades of successful evasion. The forensic evidence connecting Michael to the crimes continued to develop. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the 1980s and 1990s. Genetic material recovered from the burial sites was compared against samples taken from Michael following his arrest. The results provided scientific confirmation of his presence at the locations where the victims had been buried. Additional evidence emerged from the therapy recordings. Dr. Richard had provided the complete set of tapes from his sessions with Thomas Miller in 1985. When analyzed in sequence, the 4 recordings documented an escalating obsession with Rebecca specifically. The sessions revealed someone who had been planning his actions, wrestling with the decision, and ultimately moving toward implementation. The recordings captured the psychological progression from fantasy to intent. Investigators also reviewed Michael's employment and residential history in detail. The pattern became clearer when mapped chronologically. He had worked temporary positions that allowed flexibility and mobility. He had lived in locations that provided access to the types of public events where he found his victims. After 1994, his pattern had changed, suggesting either that he had stopped or that victims had not been reported and connected to his activities. The case drew significant media attention as details became public. Families of the 4 confirmed victims spoke about their decades of uncertainty, the painful absence of closure, and the complicated emotions that came with finally understanding what had happened to their loved ones. Jennifer, Rebecca's daughter, provided interviews describing the impact of her mother's disappearance and the surreal experience of learning the truth 38 years later. Public interest focused particularly on the role of the therapy recording in breaking the case. Dr. Richard, who had discovered the tape in his basement, found himself at the center of discussions about confidentiality, ethics, and the responsibilities of mental health professionals. He maintained that providing the evidence to authorities had been the only appropriate action given the circumstances, despite the complexity of patient privacy considerations. As Michael Ross sat in custody awaiting trial, prosecutors built their case using the convergence of evidence. The forensic findings from the burial sites, the DNA matches, the journals and photographs from the storage unit, and most distinctively, the voice on the therapy tape that could now be conclusively matched to the defendant. Modern audio analysis technology confirmed that the person speaking in those 1985 recordings was the same individual arrested in 2023. The legal proceedings would take months to unfold, but the investigation had effectively concluded. 4 women whose disappearances had haunted their families and frustrated investigators for decades had been found. The person responsible for their deaths had been identified, arrested, and charged. The evidence assembled spanned nearly 40 years, connecting past and present through the persistent work of investigators and the accidental preservation of a forgotten cassette tape. Yet questions remained. The photographs in Michael's storage unit depicted women beyond the 4 confirmed victims. Had there been others who were never reported missing or whose cases remained in unsolved files across different jurisdictions? The investigation would continue examining cold cases from locations where Michael had lived, searching for connections that might reveal the full extent of his actions across decades of hidden violence. November 2024, Marion County Courthouse, Oregon. 18 months after the discovery of remains on the rural property outside Riverside, the trial of Michael Ross commenced. The case had generated sustained public attention, both for the decades-long time span of the crimes and for the unusual evidence that had ultimately led to their solution. The courtroom filled each day with family members of victims, journalists, and observers drawn to a case that spanned nearly 40 years from crime to conviction. The prosecution presented a comprehensive narrative supported by multiple forms of evidence. Forensic experts testified about the remains discovered at the burial sites, the DNA analysis that confirmed identifications, and the physical evidence recovered alongside the victims. The testimony established not only that the 4 women had been killed and buried on property once owned by the defendant, but that the burials had occurred during years when he possessed access to the location. Dr. Richard took the stand to explain the therapy recordings from 1985. He described his practice at that time, the process by which sessions were recorded, and the circumstances under which he had discovered the tape decades later. The recordings were played in court, allowing the jury to hear the defendant's own words expressing obsession with a woman who read fortunes at fairs, specifically mentioning the Riverside event scheduled for October 1985. Audio forensic specialists testified that voice analysis conclusively matched the person on the 1985 tape to Michael Ross. Despite nearly 4 decades of aging and 2 identity changes, vocal characteristics remained consistent. The defendant's voice patterns, speech rhythms, and distinctive phrasings aligned across the temporal span, providing scientific support for what was evident to careful listeners. The journals recovered from Michael's storage unit were entered as evidence. Prosecutors used selected entries to demonstrate the defendant's mindset and pattern of behavior during the years when the crimes occurred. The writings revealed someone who had built elaborate fantasies around women he observed, interpreting normal social interactions as profound connections, and becoming frustrated when reality failed to match his delusions. Family members of the victims provided impact statements describing the decades they had spent searching for answers. Jennifer spoke about growing up without her mother, the years of uncertainty, and the strange mixture of relief and grief that came with finally learning Rebecca's fate. Other families shared similar experiences, their lives marked by absence and unanswered questions that had persisted until the excavation in April 2023. The defense attempted to challenge various elements of the prosecution's case. They questioned the chain of custody for the therapy recordings, argued about the admissibility of journals written decades earlier, and suggested that evidence from the property did not definitively connect their client to the crimes. However, the convergence of forensic evidence, documented behavior patterns, and the defendant's own recorded words created a compelling narrative that proved difficult to counter. Michael Ross declined to testify in his own defense, exercising his constitutional right to remain silent. Throughout the trial, he showed little visible emotion, sitting quietly beside his attorneys and occasionally taking notes. His demeanor remained consistent with the careful, controlled presentation he had maintained throughout his adult life, the facade of ordinariness that had allowed him to hide his activities for so long. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. Michael Ross was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the concealment of remains and the pattern of predatory behavior documented through evidence. The courtroom remained silent as the verdicts were read, the weight of decades of hidden truth finally acknowledged through the legal system. Sentencing occurred 2 months later. The judge imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring that Michael Ross would spend his remaining years in custody. In addition to the criminal convictions, the case prompted several systemic changes. Law enforcement agencies improved their protocols for cross-referencing missing persons cases across jurisdictions, recognizing that patterns can remain hidden when information stays siloed. The case also generated discussions within the mental health profession about record retention and ethical obligations when historical information might relate to serious crimes. Dr. Richard's discovery of the therapy tape had broken the case, but it also raised questions about how similar evidence might exist in other forgotten archives, waiting to provide answers to unsolved mysteries. For the families of Rebecca and the 3 other victims whose lives had been stolen decades earlier, the trial brought a form of closure that had seemed impossible for most of their lives. The women who had disappeared from fairs and public events, vanishing into mystery that haunted their loved ones, had been found and could finally be properly laid to rest. Their names were spoken in court, their lives acknowledged, their losses recognized. The case of Michael Ross stood as a testament to the persistence of truth despite the passage of time. A voice preserved on aging magnetic tape had reached across 38 years to provide the first crucial clue. Forensic science had extracted evidence from soil and remains that revealed what had been hidden. Investigators had connected patterns across decades and jurisdictions that previous technology and communication methods had kept separate. As Michael Ross was led from the courtroom to begin his life sentences, the investigation continued in a limited capacity. Detectives still reviewed cold cases from locations where he had lived, searching for other potential victims among the unsolved disappearances filed away in archives across the Pacific Northwest. The photographs found in his storage unit suggested there might have been women who caught his attention but escaped his violence, or whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. The Harvest Fair continued to be held annually in Riverside, though a small memorial now stood near the vendor area where Rebecca's booth had once been located. The plaque bore her name and the names of the other victims, ensuring that the women would be remembered not as mysteries or statistics, but as people whose lives had meaning and whose losses left permanent marks on those who loved them. Dr. Richard returned to his retirement, his unexpected role in solving a decades-old case complete. The cassette tape that had spent nearly 40 years in storage, surviving moves and cleanings and technological obsolescence, had fulfilled a purpose its creator could never have imagined. Sometimes truth waited patiently in darkness, preserved against the day when it would finally be needed. And sometimes justice, though delayed by decades, still arrived with certainty and finality.